February 8, 1943. The Intercept station sat in a converted farmhouse, 3 miles outside Algiers, hidden among olive groves that had stood for 2 centuries before anyone thought to fight a war here. Corporal Daniel Reeves hunched over his SCR-187 receiver in what used to be someone's bedroom, now crammed with equipment that hummed and crackled through the North African night. His shift had started at 6 p.m. It was now 2:30 a.m. 7.5 hours of listening to German radio traffic, logging transmissions, noting frequencies and call signs, writing it all down in meticulous shorthand that intelligence officers would analyze in the morning. His neck ached. His eyes burned from the single dim bulb hanging above his desk. Outside, he could hear wind moving through the olive trees, a sound that reminded him of home, of Oregon, of a life that seemed impossibly distant now. The headphones pressed against his ears delivered a constant stream of sound, Morse code clicking in rapid bursts, voice transmissions in German, sometimes clear, sometimes distorted by atmospheric conditions, the background hiss of empty frequencies. Radio traffic from Rommel's Afrika Korps units scattered across Tunisia, units that were talking constantly as they maneuvered, repositioned, prepared for the next phase of fighting that everyone knew was coming. Reeves had been monitoring German military communications for 4 months now, since arriving in Algeria in October as part of the Signal Intelligence Service detachment attached to Allied Forces headquarters. He knew the patterns. He recognized individual German radio operators by their distinctive sending styles, the rhythms they created when tapping out Morse code. He could identify units by their call signs, track their movements by changes in signal strength, estimate distances based on how clearly their transmissions came through. Tonight felt different. Not obviously wrong, not alarmingly strange, just incomplete in a way he could not articulate. For 3 hours, he had been monitoring the frequency range assigned to German mechanized units in the Kasserine Pass area, the mountainous terrain where American and German forces had been skirmishing for weeks. The traffic should have been consistent. Routine communications between battalion headquarters and company positions, supply coordination, status reports. But something was missing. Reeves could not identify what exactly, but the absence gnawed at him like a tooth that had started to hurt without yet becoming truly painful. He made a note in his logbook. 2:37 a.m. Reduced traffic on mechanized frequencies. Possible radio silence protocol. He then leaned back in his chair and tried to think through what silence might mean. In signals intelligence work, silence was often more significant than noise. When units went quiet, when transmissions ceased on frequencies that had been active for days or weeks, it suggested something was being hidden. Preparations for an attack, perhaps, or a withdrawal, or the movement of forces to new positions where their presence needed to remain secret. German radio discipline had improved dramatically since the early months of the war. By 1943, the Wehrmacht communications officers understood that every transmission could be intercepted, that patterns of radio traffic revealed as much as the content of messages. They had learned to minimize transmissions during critical periods, to use couriers and landlines when possible, to maintain radio silence when surprise mattered more than coordination. But silence created its own problems. Modern mobile warfare required constant communication. Armor, artillery, infantry, reconnaissance units all needed to share information rapidly to respond to changing battlefield conditions. Radio was the only technology that allowed real-time coordination across dispersed forces. Going silent meant accepting reduced situational awareness, slower response times, increased risk of units becoming separated or out of position. Commanders had to balance security against operational necessity. When they chose silence, it meant something significant was happening, something important enough to justify the friction that silence created. Reeves had been trained to recognize these patterns, to notice when normal communication rhythms changed, to flag anomalies for analysis by officers who saw the larger intelligence picture. He picked up the field telephone and cranked the handle twice. The duty officer answered on the third ring, sounding tired. Reeves identified himself and explained what he was hearing, or rather, what he was not hearing. The officer listened without interrupting, then asked him to continue monitoring and report any changes. Standard procedure. Silence alone was not actionable intelligence. It was a data point, a fragment, that might mean something when combined with other fragments from other sources. Reeves hung up the phone and returned to his headphones. He began scanning adjacent frequencies, checking whether German units had simply shifted to different parts of the radio spectrum. He found nothing unusual. The mechanized frequencies remained quiet. Too quiet. At 3:10 a.m., the silence broke. Not with a transmission, but with something stranger. A brief pulse of carrier wave on a frequency that had shown no activity for 2 weeks. Just a test pulse, the radio equivalent of someone checking whether their equipment was working. It lasted perhaps 2 seconds, then cut off. Reeves noted it in his logbook, but did not report it immediately. Test pulses happened constantly. Radio operators routinely checked their equipment, verified connections, ensured transmitters and receivers functioned properly before beginning actual communications. A single test pulse meant nothing by itself. But 15 minutes later, it came again. Same frequency, same brief pulse, followed by silence. Then another at 3:42 a.m. Then 3:58 a.m. A pattern was forming. Someone out there in the darkness was preparing to transmit, checking the frequency, making sure it was clear and that their equipment worked. Standard procedure before breaking radio silence after a long, quiet period. Reeves understood what he was witnessing. Somewhere in the Kasserine Pass, a German unit that had maintained perfect radio silence for at least 2 weeks was about to resume communications. The question was why? Why now, at 4 a.m. on a February morning? What had changed? What required them to risk transmitting after maintaining such careful silence? He picked up the telephone again, called the duty officer, and explained the test pulses. This time, the officer's response was different. He told Reeves to continue monitoring and to transcribe everything that came through on that frequency, word for word. He was sending someone from G2 Intelligence Section to observe. Within 20 minutes, a lieutenant arrived pulling a chair beside Reeves' desk, notebook open, pen ready. At 4:17 a.m., the transmission began. Voice, not code. Clear German spoken with a Saxon accent that Reeves recognized immediately. The voice belonged to a radio operator he had heard before, weeks earlier, transmitting from what traffic analysis had identified as a Panzer Regiment headquarters. The operator was reading a list. Grid coordinates paired with unit designators, 27 pairs in total, each one representing a position and the unit occupying it. The transmission lasted 8 minutes. When it ended, the frequency went silent again, But those 8 minutes had revealed something extraordinary. The grid coordinates formed a pattern across the western approaches to Kasserine Pass, positions that created a defensive arc facing the American forces assembled near the town of Sidi Bouzid. And the units represented were not defensive infantry. They were panzer battalions, mechanized infantry, self-propelled artillery, an entire armored battle group assembled in positions that Allied intelligence had not identified. The lieutenant sitting beside Reeves wrote furiously, transcribing every coordinate, every unit designation. When the transmission ended, he grabbed the telephone and called directly to G2 headquarters, woke up the chief intelligence officer, read the Intercept.
Within an hour, every signals intelligence station in North Africa had been redirected to monitor frequencies associated with German armored formations. Within 3 hours, 3 more intercepts had confirmed the presence of at least 2 panzer divisions assembled near Kasserine, positioned for what could only be a major offensive. Within 6 hours, Allied commanders were repositioning forces, reinforcing defensive positions, preparing for an attack that intelligence now predicted would come within 48 hours. The attack came on February 14th, exactly as predicted. German forces punched through American defensive lines at Sidi Bouzid, destroyed 2 battalions, captured hundreds of prisoners, advanced rapidly through Kasserine Pass toward the supply depots at Tebessa. It was the first major engagement between American and German ground forces in World War II, and it was a disaster for the Americans. Inexperienced troops, poor coordination, inadequate equipment, confused command structure – all contributed to a defeat that sent American forces reeling backward 40 miles in 3 days. But the defeat could have been catastrophic if Allied intelligence had not identified the German buildup, if commanders had not repositioned forces based on Reeves's intercept. The breakthrough at Kasserine might have shattered the entire Allied position in Tunisia. Instead, American forces conducted a fighting withdrawal, maintained cohesion, established new defensive lines, and eventually stopped the German advance. The intelligence gained from radio intercepts did not prevent the defeat, but it prevented annihilation. That distinction, invisible in most historical accounts, meant thousands of lives. Daniel Reeves never learned the full significance of what he heard that February night. He filed his report, continued his monitoring duties, completed his shift, and went to sleep in a tent behind the farmhouse. His logbook entry was one fragment among thousands that G2 intelligence officers analyzed daily, trying to piece together German intentions from incomplete information. Reeves knew he had intercepted something important. He knew his report had generated urgent activity at higher headquarters. But the compartmentalized nature of signals intelligence meant he never saw the larger picture, never understood how his patient attention to an absence of sound had contributed to decisions that shaped battles he would never witness. This was typical of signals intelligence work in World War II. The men and women who collected the information rarely knew how it was used. Security required strict compartmentalization. Operators listened and transcribed. Traffic analysts studied patterns. Crypto-analysts worked to break codes. Intelligence officers synthesized everything into assessments. Commanders made decisions based on those assessments. Each group worked in isolation, trusting that others were doing their jobs, that the system as a whole was functioning, even though no single person could see the complete picture. The system worked because it was designed to work despite this fragmentation. Information flowed upward through carefully controlled channels. Operators like Reeves fed information to analysts, who fed assessments to commanders, who fed orders back down to the forces that would execute them. It was inefficient in some ways. Information that might have been useful to multiple groups was locked in compartments where only authorized personnel could access it. But inefficiency was the price of security. If everyone knew everything, the risk of compromise increased exponentially. Better to keep information compartmentalized, to trust that the right people were seeing the right intelligence, to accept that individual contributors would never fully understand their contribution's significance. Reeves understood this intellectually, but understanding did not eliminate frustration. He wanted to know what his intercepts meant, what actions they prompted, what difference they made. Instead, he sat in a converted bedroom, night after night, listening to German radio traffic that mostly consisted of routine communications about supplies, personnel movements, equipment status, things that seemed trivial and meaningless. The work was monotonous, exhausting, isolating. He shared the farmhouse with 5 other radio operators, but they worked different shifts, monitored different frequencies, rarely saw each other except during shift changes. The isolation was deliberate. Signals intelligence personnel were not supposed to discuss their work with anyone, even with others doing the same job. Security protocols prohibited casual conversation about intercepts, about patterns observed, about anything that might compromise operational security. So, Reeves worked alone, listening to German radio traffic, a language he understood but could not respond to, recording conversations between men he would never meet, documenting a war he experienced only through electromagnetic waves propagating through the North African night. It was a strange way to fight. No weapons, no direct confrontation, no visible enemy. Just headphones and receivers and logbooks. Just patient attention to sounds that most people would dismiss as meaningless noise. Yet this invisible war mattered as much as the visible one being fought with tanks and artillery and infantry. The intelligence collected through radio intercepts shaped commanders' decisions, influenced tactical and strategic planning, provided advantage that could not be achieved through firepower alone. The British had understood this earlier and more completely than the Americans. Their Y service, a network of radio intercept stations established during the First World War and expanded dramatically after 1939, had been collecting German radio traffic since the war's beginning. They had developed sophisticated techniques for traffic analysis, for studying the patterns and volumes of enemy communications without necessarily understanding the content of individual messages. They had learned to identify military units by their communication signatures, to track movements by changes in signal strength and direction, to predict offensive operations by observing increases in radio traffic that preceded major attacks. American signals intelligence in 1943 was still maturing, still learning lessons the British had already absorbed. The partnership between American and British signals intelligence services was both collaborative and competitive. They shared information, coordinated intercept coverage, divided responsibility for monitoring different areas and frequencies. But they also guarded their most sensitive capabilities, maintained separate analysis centers, sometimes withheld information from each other when security concerns overrode the benefits of full cooperation. The relationship was complicated by differences in organizational culture, by competing priorities, by the inevitable friction that arose when 2 powerful intelligence services tried to work together while maintaining their institutional independence. For operators like Reeves, these high-level complexities were invisible. He received his assignments, monitored his frequencies, filed his reports, and trusted that someone somewhere was making sense of it all. February 1943 was a crucial period in the North African Campaign. The Allies had landed in Algeria and Morocco the November before, had fought their way eastward into Tunisia, and now faced German and Italian forces that were simultaneously being pushed westward by British forces advancing from Libya. The Germans were caught between 2 Allied armies, fighting a defensive campaign in mountainous terrain that favored defense, trying to delay inevitable defeat long enough to evacuate as many troops as possible to Europe. Kasserine Pass represented Rommel's final attempt to disrupt Allied plans, to strike a blow that might buy time, create breathing room, demonstrate that the Afrika Korps could still fight effectively despite overwhelming Allied superiority in men and material. The attack succeeded tactically, but failed strategically. American forces at Kasserine were badly beaten, suffered heavy casualties, lost equipment and prestige, but they remained an intact fighting force. The defeat was not catastrophic because intelligence had provided warning, because commanders had time to prepare defensive positions, because reserves could be positioned to prevent complete collapse. Without that warning, without the intelligence gained from signals intercepts like the one Reeves captured, the offensive might have achieved breakthrough, might have severed Allied supply lines, might have changed the campaign's trajectory. Intelligence did not win battles, but it created conditions where battles could be fought on terms more favorable to Allied forces. Reeves continued his monitoring duties throughout the Kasserine fighting and afterward. He listened as German units regrouped following their offensive, as they fell back to new defensive positions, as traffic patterns shifted from offensive to defensive operations. He logged hundreds of transmissions, most routine, some significant, all contributing to the accumulated intelligence that shaped Allied understanding of German capabilities and intentions. His work was invisible, unrecognized, unacknowledged except by the handful of intelligence officers who read his reports and incorporated them into their analyses. He received no medals, no commendations, no public recognition. His name appeared in no histories. His contribution was documented only in classified files that would remain secret for decades after the war. This was the nature of signals intelligence work. It was invisible by design, secret by necessity, its practitioners anonymous by requirement. The effectiveness of signals intelligence depended absolutely on the enemy never knowing their communications were being intercepted and exploited. If the Germans discovered that Allied forces were systematically monitoring their radio traffic, they would change procedures, alter codes, impose stricter radio silence, take countermeasures that would dramatically reduce intelligence collection. So,
Signals intelligence operations remained deeply classified throughout the war and for many years afterward. The men and women who did this work could not discuss it with family or friends, could not explain what they did or why it mattered, had to carry their knowledge in silence. After Kasserine, the North African campaign moved toward its inevitable conclusion. Allied forces tightened the noose around German positions in Tunisia, applied constant pressure, prevented escape. On May 13, 1943, the last Axis forces in Africa surrendered. Over 275,000 German and Italian soldiers became prisoners of war. It was a complete victory, a turning point that secured Allied control of the Mediterranean and set the stage for the invasion of Sicily and Italy. Signals intelligence had contributed to that victory in countless small ways that never appeared in official histories. Radio intercepts had revealed German defensive positions, identified reinforcement patterns, predicted counterattacks, tracked supply movements, assessed morale and readiness. Each intercept was a small piece of a vast puzzle that intelligence officers assembled patiently over months of continuous collection and analysis. Daniel Reeves moved with Allied forces from North Africa to Sicily, then to Italy, continuing his monitoring duties through each phase of the Mediterranean campaign. He spent the war listening to German radio traffic, watching patterns evolve as German forces adapted to changing circumstances, as new units arrived and old ones were destroyed or withdrawn, as the Wehrmacht learned to operate under conditions of Allied air superiority and signals intelligence exploitation. He became expert at his craft, learned to recognize subtle indicators of significant activity, developed intuition about when routine traffic masked important developments. His reports became valued by intelligence officers who learned to trust his assessments, who understood that his experience gave him perspective that newer operators lacked. The war ended for Reeves in Austria in May 1945, when German forces surrendered and radio traffic from Wehrmacht units ceased. After 4 years of continuous monitoring, after thousands of hours listening to German voices planning operations and coordinating movements and reporting casualties, the silence was absolute and permanent. Reeves returned to the United States, was discharged from the Army, went home to Oregon, and tried to resume a life that no longer fit him. He could not discuss what he had done during the war.
Security classifications remained in effect. The work was still secret, the techniques still sensitive, the organizations still operating against new adversaries. So Reeves said nothing. When people asked about his service, he gave vague answers. Radio work, communications, nothing interesting. He found employment with a telephone company, married, had children, built a quiet life. Decades later, after classifications were lifted and historians began piecing together the secret history of signals intelligence in World War II, Reeves learned that his February 1943 Intercept had been cited in multiple intelligence assessments about the Kasserine offensive. His name appeared in declassified reports as the operator who first identified the German armored buildup, whose alert had prompted the redistribution of Intercept resources that confirmed the threat. He learned that intelligence officers had considered his work exemplary, that his reports had been used to train new operators, that his techniques had been incorporated into standard operating procedures. None of this had been communicated to him during the war or immediately after. He discovered it only by accident, reading through newly released documents at a National Archives facility, finding his name in reports he had never known existed. By then, he was an old man, his war service a distant memory, the significance of his contribution something he had never fully understood. The recognition came too late to affect his life or career, but it provided a kind of closure, an understanding that the invisible work he had done in a converted farmhouse outside Algiers had mattered in ways he had never been permitted to know. The war that Reeves fought was not the war of newsreels and memoirs, not the war of generals and grand strategy, but the war of patient attention, of technical competence, of trust that small contributions accumulated into decisive advantage. It was a war fought in the electromagnetic spectrum, where victory came not from destroying the enemy, but from understanding him better than he understood himself. This understanding was built by thousands of people like Daniel Reeves, radio operators and traffic analysts and cryptanalysts and intelligence officers, all working within a system designed to convert raw intercepts into actionable intelligence. The system was imperfect, sometimes slow, often frustrating, but it worked well enough to give Allied commanders an edge they could not have achieved through conventional reconnaissance alone. That edge did not guarantee victory in any single battle, but it shaped the conditions under which battles were fought, influenced decisions about where to attack and when to defend, provided warning that saved lives and prevented disasters. The value of signals intelligence could not be measured in any single intercept or operation, but in the accumulated advantage it provided over years of continuous effort. When historians study World War II signals intelligence, they focus primarily on high-level code breaking, on the dramatic achievements of Bletchley Park and the breaking of Enigma, on magic and the reading of Japanese diplomatic and military communications. These achievements were genuinely significant, provided strategic intelligence that influenced major decisions, but they represented only part of the signals intelligence picture. The larger part, less dramatic but equally important, consisted of tactical intelligence collected by operators like Reeves, men and women who monitored enemy communications, studied traffic patterns, recognized anomalies, provided the raw material that analysts used to understand enemy capabilities and intentions. This tactical intelligence rarely changed the course of the war in obvious ways, but it shaped the daily decisions about how to fight, where to position forces, when to attack or defend. The story of signals intelligence in World War II is not primarily a story of brilliant breakthroughs or dramatic moments, though those certainly occurred. It is fundamentally a story of patient, meticulous work performed by thousands of people over years of continuous effort. Work that rarely produced perfect clarity, but frequently provided sufficient understanding to make better decisions than would otherwise have been possible. It was a story about attention, about the value of listening carefully, about recognizing that silence can be as informative as speech, about trusting that small observations matter, even when their significance is not immediately apparent. Daniel Reeves, listening to German radio traffic in a North African farmhouse, embodied these principles. His contribution was small, measured in isolation, but essential when combined with contributions from hundreds of others doing similar work in similar obscurity. Together, they created an intelligence capability that gave Allied forces advantage that helped win the war.